Now, I've seen some bad parts in my time, but nothing for me is worse than this card. The legendary pile of shit which you can somehow still buy new online today. Yep, that's right, you can buy a 17-year-old AGP graphics card that beat its predecessor in titles by a whopping 0.3%. But here on this channel we like to see what the cards can do more than what they can't do. So let's take a look at the GeForce 2 MX400. The card itself was released on Q1 of 2001 with a crazy 200MHz on core and 65MB of SDR VRAM clocked in at 166MHz. It's based on the NV11 architecture, which uses the 180nm lithography, complete with 4 text units and 2 fragment pipelines and 0 vertex pipelines. It sure is packing some serious power. But let's not forget this card does actually support up to DirectX 7 for all your gaming needs. Yeah, and OpenGL 1 actually. I didn't think it would have that, but it does. So are there any redeeming factors to this card? Well, it does support up to 1080p and even just slightly higher than that through its VGA ports, so I guess that's something. Now, this card was made to give Nvidia something to sell in the mid-range market, as many OEM systems were still incorporating the older TNT2 cards or another company's Vanta-based GPUs into their systems, which ultimately were getting rather dated by this point and were giving the company a sort of bad reputation. The MX400 was the most powerful addition to these new cards that they introduced, with the ultimate goal being able to take the hold on the mainstream, and it achieved it with some great results as many OEMs sought to have their card in the system, thanks to its low cost and decent-ish performance. And the fact it was incorporated with later NForce chips only went on to help this. However, performance during this time was increasing in leaps and bounds thanks to ATI and Nvidia both being very competitive. ATI's new 9000 series was ready to grab hold of the mainstream, leaving Nvidia with no options to combat it with many of the benchmarks featuring the MX400 actually leaving it in the dust. But due to the card's major adoption in the time it was released, it's still being sold today. So let's see what it can do. Up first we have actually running a 1080p desktop, which the card was able to do. Although moving some items around was a tad sluggish, it wasn't too bad. The card itself does boast the ability to run dual monitors, but my model only has one VGA output, so I didn't get to test that exciting feature, and I doubt running two 1080p screens would fare much better. But as if seeing what it can do to a screen wasn't exciting enough, we have some gaming performance. And I expected it to be pretty horrible from what I can remember, but we actually saw something very reminiscent of that pretty much. Up first we have Half-Life 1 from 1998 running in the 240p resolution for a lovely 8fps average. But hey, the eye can only see 24fps, so this is nearly buttery smooth to me. But that's the Steam version, as the card only supports OpenGL version 1, pretty much any game using the OpenGL API will look like this. As soon as I busted out the retail disc version, we saw a much nicer experience with a 71fps average, which only ever dropped down to 66fps in very intensive scenes, and this was all in the enhanced 480p resolution. Halo Combat Evolved in 480p achieved a 27fps average with constant dips down to the mid-teens, even hitting 12fps when there was a lot going on. If you loaded up a lower resolution or forced off some settings, you could likely push it up to just about a 30fps average, but in its current state, it's worse than the Intel GMA 950 we saw on that laptop just a little while ago. Sid Meier's Pirates in 480p with low settings ran at a nice 30fps average when sailing across the world maps and engaging in naval warfare. However, actual combat could drop down your FPS just a tiny bit, but actually going into sword fights would make the game a stuttering mess, eventually hitting 11fps at its worst, and overall I wouldn't call it unplayable as it is a slower paced game, but it sure isn't what I'd call an ideal experience. Morrowind was a bit of a surprise here, which ran at a smooth 32fps average when exploring most of the map, and would hover around this for quite a lot of the time. However, moment dips down to 8fps could occur if you were in combat and loaded up the inventory at the same time, as combat itself slowed down the FPS to around 20fps. But still, for the state of the card, I'm not going to argue with it, as this was all in low settings at 480p, and you'd really have to mess around with some INI files if you wanted to get much better. As for simpler 2D titles and basic games like The Sims or those older 3D ID title games, these games run very well. I mean, it's what the card was designed to play. So if you need to play some of those older titles, these are great cards to get, as they seem to be very easy to get. But that doesn't mean I'm going to recommend it, because, I mean, I've seen very, very, very cheap used cards going around the price of this new, such as the ATI Radeon 9500. This card has around twice the power, and sells for the same price, so I'd recommend looking for one like that. Thank you very much for watching this video on one of the worst cards I've ever used. Good night. Well, it sure is good to be back. The Q&A is all recorded, and I have a pretty interesting video coming up next which the Patreons have actually voted for. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, or dislike if you didn't like it, and I'd hope to see you all in the next video.